This is Legislatures, the Inside Story. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Tim Story, the CEO of the National Conference of State Legislatures, where we have teams of researchers who help lawmakers and legislative staff understand issues and ideas that are at play in capitals around the country. And in the podcast, I like to take a deeper look at ideas that can help lawmakers and legislative staff and the people who work in capitals be better at their jobs, better leaders, and work together. Today we're going to talk about storytelling and how important it can be in the process of leadership, of getting your ideas across, no matter your role in the State House. Especially for people who don't already know who you are. Your story can mean a lot. To help us out, I'm going to talk to Donna Washington, a master storyteller. She's lucky enough that that's her full-time job, storytelling. She's won multiple awards for her CDs and her work at festivals internationally and around the country. She's written children's books that are bestsellers. She served on the North Carolina Storytelling Guild and on the board of the National Association of Black Storytellers. Donna Washington, I'm so glad you're here. I've gotten to know you because you've spoken at several NCSL summits, and I couldn't be happier to chat with you today. Let's start with you talking about your road to now. How did you become a storyteller extraordinaire?
Well, my road is a little strange, I guess. I'm one of 7 children. My father was an officer in the United States Army. And because there were 7 of us, we were a traveling circus. We would make up plays for my parents on the weekends on Saturday. And then we'd bring them breakfast in bed, and all 7 of us would do these little plays that we'd written, these skits we'd written. So I did a lot of theater and science. Those are my favorite 2 things, biology and theater, all the way through high school. I come from a family where we do a lot of family sharing and a lot of theater and music and all this kind of stuff. I started performing in competitions, just, like forensics, which is a big thing in schools, speech and all debate. I did a lot of debate. And I went to University Northwestern for pre-law. And I was there for a couple days, and I saw the theater students doing their in-service, like they're going around and, meeting people and doing whatever. And I thought, that looks way more fun than pre-law. So I switched my major and didn't tell my parents until Christmas. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be theater now. And they were like, okay, as long as you're happy. And I was like, oh, that was easy. In my 3rd year when I was at university, I was cast in a piece of theater where I had to pretend to be a storyteller. That's when I made the transition, but I was the only person who didn't know that I had become a storyteller. And after the show was over that was attached to this class, man walks up to me, points at me and says, you should be a storyteller. And he was the chair of the children's theater department. I'd never seen him before. He was brand new. And I was 20 nothing. And when he said that to me, I thought, whatever, okay. Sure, I'll be a storyteller, whatever. He then signs me up for 2 graduate classes. And I was an undergrad, and I wasn't even allowed to take them without permission. He walks up to me, hands me my schedule, and says, I don't know what else you have to take to graduate, but you must take these 2 classes. So I show up the first day, and I'm like little undergrad in class with all these really old people. I'm sure they were in their mid-20s.
And this is at Northwestern in Evanston in Chicago. Yeah.
Northwestern in Evanston, right outside Chicago.
Very esteemed, prestigious school. Yeah. Big time.
Yes. It is a great school. And I'm sitting in this class with these like really senior looking people. Well, not senior, like aged, but like older, wiser looking people. And everyone's going around talking about why they're taking this class. They're all like writing their doctorates and all this stuff. And it gets to me. And before I can say anything, my professor says, that's Donna. She's already a storyteller. She's just here to learn new stories. And then the next person went. And he spent the next 2 years convincing me to be a storyteller. And when I graduated from university at the ripe old age of 21, I was like, okay. And I've never done anything else. So I have been a professional storyteller for 34 years.
I have spent a lot of time looking at census data and demographics and things of that nature. And I know that the Department of Labor puts out like jobs that people will have, right? And I'm pretty sure that storyteller on your business card is not something that a lot of people do. You're graduating 21, like, well, my career is storytelling. Your father, and probably your mom too, I'm guessing, are like, wow, we want you to be happy. You seem awfully happy, but where does one apply to be storyteller? Now, were you in Illinois? I'm kind of curious. I love to know where people are from.
I spent a lot of my childhood in South Korea, in Asia.
Okay, sure.
3 of my siblings are adopted from there.
Okay. Of the seven, okay.
That's how we got to 7. I was born in Colorado, Colorado Springs, Colorado. There's a military base there,
Well, at Fort Carson or at the...
Fort Carson. So I was born in Colorado, and then, we moved all over the place. I graduated from high school. The last high school I went to was in Indiana. And then I graduated from Illinois, from Northwestern. I stayed in that area for about 7 years. That's where I ended up meeting my husband. I was at ground zero for some of the most amazing storytelling in the country. Jim May was living up in Woodstock at that point, Woodstock, Illinois, and he ran the Illinois Storytelling Festival, which is one of the biggest festivals in the country. I called him right after I graduated, brand new storyteller. And his festival was in the summer. And I said, I'm brand new storyteller. Can I have a spot there? And the way he used to do it was he would invite you to come to the children's tent and do one story. And he would watch and see if you were worthy to be anywhere else.
So that was the audition.
Yes. So I made the trip. I got on the train. I went up to Woodstock. I was terrified. I got up. I had half an hour to tell. I told 2 stories, I think. He stood in the back of the tent, just watching me with his arms folded. He didn't say anything. And then when I was done, I looked up, he had gone. I was like, oh no. And then after that, he invited me to come back every year that I lived there. It took maybe 3 years and I was featured there. So by the time I was 24, I'd been featured at one of the major festivals in the country. From that, piggybacking on that, I met storytellers from all over the world because it was such a huge festival. It was an international festival. I met the sort of like the bedrock of the performers. I got to see what storytelling looked like. I got to figure out like what was good and what wasn't good and what I wanted. I started working as a storyteller full-time right out of school. I have had 3 temp jobs in my entire life. I assumed I'd be having them a long time, but that first couple of years. And then I just got what I could say are breaks. They're just where you don't expect something to happen and you just happen to be somewhere and something works out. I did some wordless picture books for a book company.
Wait a minute. So you did wordless picture books. What does that mean? You drew? You have an artistic...
I'm not an artist. Both my children are, but I'm not. They asked me to come in and do some recording. I was hired to do some recording for Warren Coleman Productions. And I came in to do like a little video for him. And I did all the voices and whatever. And he was like, I think I know a company that would really love it if you would do some wordless like folklore. Come in, just do some folklore. We'll record your voice on the tape. We'll get some artists to draw pictures. And it's one of those things where bing, and then you turn the page. There's no words in the book. It's just me telling stories. If you're bing, you turn the page and you see some pictures. So I ended up with just randomly, like first I did this little video. Then I did this thing with the books. And there was a problem. The problem was I didn't sound like a black lady. So they were concerned that they had hired a white woman to come in and do the folklore in these books that are African-American stories. So they invited me to come out to California to their big conference, and I was going to be like their secret guest. And I was going to tell the stories out loud so all the salespeople could see that I really was a black person. And while I was there, a woman I'd never seen before offered me her business card. She said, do you write books? And I said, no, I don't write books. Not yet. I don't know enough. I was like 23. She said, you should write books. And she handed me her business card. Like, that doesn't happen. That's ridiculous. And I was like, she must publish out of her basement. And then I went home. I flew home to Chicago. I lost her card. Like 4 months later, I'm cleaning off my desk. I find her business card. And I was like, I think I vaguely recognize the name of this company, but I bet she publishes out of her basement. No one just gives you their card. So I call her and she was like, I was just thinking about you. And I'm like, yeah, right. She's saying, oh, I'm thinking it'll be cool if you could do this. And I'm like, what do you even publish? She got really quiet. I was like, either I have totally embarrassed myself or I have embarrassed her. Let's figure out which one it is. She said, how about if I sent you some books? And I was like, oh, totally out of your basement. Nobody does this. So like the next day, a courier arrived with this big box. And I open the box, and the very first book on the top is Where the Wild Things Are.
Oh, so this is pretty legit.
I'm talking to HarperCollins.
And this is before the internet, I'm guessing. You couldn't just pull out your phone and find out. You thought she was some rinky-dink. This isn't legit. But that's, you said you get breaks, right? You got this. What an incredible break. She was in the room. You were in the room. She recognized your ability. God, you must have just exuded or oozed confidence.
The things I'm good at doing, I don't question those things. Like, I can have no confidence in my ability to make a good latte. I'm really bad at that. But I've been performing since I was 6 years old in one way or another. So getting, I might be even nervous getting up in front of a group of people. Once I get up there, though, it's like the muscle I've been using since I was little. I can sell a thing. And the more I learned about what it is I was selling, the better I got at being able to do it.
So let's get to it then. The big question is, why does storytelling matter, especially for people who are trying to craft the best public policy and craft good laws to serve the people as best they can? However you define that. Like,
if you want to reach someone and you have different points of view, stories are the best way to do that. People are not moved by facts. They're not moved by statistics. They're not moved by numbers. So if you really want to get to the average person, you have to find a way past the defenses that filter out, we don't agree with each other, so I don't like what you're saying. But if you can figure out a way to do it in story, you can make connectivity with another person. My favorite saying is, it's hard to hate someone if you know their stories. If you can find the commonality with the person you're trying to deal with, you can use that to go into what you want to talk about, and you could actually have a conversation.
We could jump off a number of places here, but this notion of it's hard to hate someone if you know their story. Because it sure seems like, and I think there's a little mythology here that, all the politicians do, one team's wearing a red jersey and one team's wearing a blue jersey, and they hate each other and they just yell at each other. And sure, there are a few on each of these teams, certainly in Washington, but I think less so in state capitals, who their goal is to wake up and trend on Twitter. Their goal is not to actually accomplish anything or talk to anyone. The vast majority of legislators and legislative staff who do this as well, they want to make some progress. They all come in with these motives like, I want to kind of do what's right for my people, for my state. It's hard to hate someone if you know their story, right?
The truth is, we're all people. So there aren't a variety of different stories. There are some universal stories, and then there's variations on that theme. This is how folklore works, right? You're telling everybody's story, even though the stories are about kings and queens or the poorest man in town or whatever. There are some really basic things everybody wants. We all want to be safe. We all want to make sure that the people we love are safe. We all need enough resources, whether that's to eat or to be warm in the wintertime. There's some basic universal things. Government, at least in my understanding of it, is about making sure that we provide the things that people need. Then there's all the ice cream, right? There's the extra stuff. So I think our biggest problem is we don't know the difference between, or at least when we're arguing, we're not necessarily arguing the difference between what we need and what we want. A lot of people think we need ice cream. Ice cream is extra stuff. Now, for me, libraries are really necessary. I don't think that is extra stuff. But there are people in the world who think that libraries are extra. So then, you're talking about funding. Well, we'll cut library funding. Oh my gosh, don't do that. So that is the way I think about the stories. They're universal. And if you can figure out what's extra, you can fight about those things. But how do you provide the basic stuff? So when you're talking to another person, it shouldn't be hard to figure out what the basic things are, because they're basic for everybody. They're basic for everybody.
You have actually just sort of described the daily life of legislator X out in America, which is there's not unlimited resources. The revenue that comes into states to pay for schools and healthcare and roads and libraries and monitoring clean air and enforcing the law and making sure that the streets are safe and having law enforcement, limited resources, and you're trying to decide this. And you're advocating, not you, Donna, but you, legislator, are advocating for the things you want to prioritize because there's at the end of the day, you got to share all these resources, right? You can't fund everything at the top level. So you got to go out and persuade people. This is where we get to, okay, legislators in many ways are in the persuasion business. It's always a matter of trying to find the middle ground of we can put more money here, more money there. And if we pass this regulation, it hurts some people, but helps a lot of people. We've talked about why stories are so important. Now I'll talk about how to tell good stories, especially in the persuasion business.
First, you have to make sure that the story you're telling is a story it's about us. There are two different kinds of stories. There's a me story and there's a we story. All right? Me stories are the stories that you tell that make everyone sit back and go, wow, look at you. And we stories are the stories that say, wow, we're all in this together.
That's a really awesome nugget. Go ahead, expand on that. Yeah.
So a we story starts from a place that gathers us all in. So let's say, for instance, you're talking about child hunger. Not every child in the world or in your community has ever experienced child hunger. Some of them have, some of them haven't. But everyone understands what it is to want something and not be able to get it. And everyone understands that it is a bad thing when children are hungry. Because when they are, crime goes up. When they are, education rates come down. Hungry children cannot work or study. It's detrimental on so many other things in society for there to be hungry children. However, let's back this up a little bit. In the 1900s, early 1900s, we had our Dust Bowl situation, right? Where children were hungry, the farmers' children were hungry, and they introduced welfare. And they said, these children were hungry, their families have been feeding us, and we need to feed them. And welfare passed. And now we were upholding the people who had helped us. Then we hit the 80s, and President Reagan said, all of these people sponging off society. Look at this black woman with her Cadillac and her children. She doesn't need help. We should cut food subsidies. That's a completely different story. You're not helping hungry children. You're allowing these terrible parents to sponge off society. Did we have less hungry children in the 80s than we had in the 1940s? No, we had more. And yet, the new narrative allowed us to cut food subsidies. We are a very amorphous group. We are easy to lead once you tell us a story that we can hold on to. How you decide to shape that story will depend on what you can do. So you're talking about persuading people.
I'm thinking about this in a very different way than I ever have before. I mean, we all know the kind of the story of Ronald Reagan convincing, the Congress to reallocate whatever money they were spending there. And I don't remember the policy details, but I was just struck by the fact that that was very effective. Here we sit, I don't know how long ago was Reagan, 80. So we're 40 years on, and we're still remembering that he told this story of the woman in the Cadillac on food stamps or whatever. So that story was sort of strikingly effective. Who knows where the truth is, right? I think we don't have time to get into that. But the point is the story, the way he framed it there, again, agree or disagree, that was an effective story, which actually brings up a whole other question. Stories can be dangerous, by the way. And not that Reagan's story was dangerous, but you can use storytelling to do all kinds of things. Okay, that's a great point, Donna. Go ahead.
But think about this. The reason why he could do that because his me story was also really strong. Look at me. He's someone people looked up to. They remember the Gipper, right?
when he could relate, he related to people. He even though I don't recall all of his. He was born in Illinois, actually, as you know, and became an actor and all of that.
And people thought about his image of who he was as an actor. His me story sounded like a we story.
Yes, he made himself every American, right? Which is impossible because we're like we're tens of millions of different people, and
exactly. But because he was able to do that, he then took the power of that and changed our we story. He did something, and politicians do this all the time. How do you decide who you're going to help and who you're not going to help? How do you decide how you allocate funds? There's all kinds of ways to do it. But unfortunately, a lot of times in legislatures, in order to decide who gets what, we tell stories that other people. We put them on the outside of what's okay. And then we decide that they don't deserve to be helped because they're the other. And we put everyone in that basket who might do a thing that this group is doing. And then we go, well, we're not going to help them.
But this is getting to know everybody's story, right? Because if all I do is my district is heavily urban, and I never go and talk to rural America person, and of course exactly the opposite, right? Then you kind of only know that story. But if you can tell a story that says, "Hey, I got an idea here, program, whatever," or maybe we're going to cut X, Y, or Z, but we're going to talk about the story of how it matters to a person in mountain setting, person on the sea, person in the plains. It's how it relates to everybody. Maybe that's a key to effective storytelling is don't just think about one type of person that you're trying to communicate to, but maybe maybe that's the real challenge. How do I get this to relate to tell their story, the we story, not my group.
Right. And I think to me, that's the essence of what politics should be, that we're trying to figure out how to work as a society. But what I was kind of talking about is what we do with our we stories. We think of, we need to be a larger group. When you talk about your red hat, your blue hat, right? We tell stories about what's good for our we. And then we're like, there's other people. They're out there. And we don't have to worry about that. That's kind of like the camp we got into. And I think in state legislatures, it's even harder because your we is the people who voted for you. That's who your community is, right? And then you're trying to fight for that community and then the other people out there or the other. What I think would be cool, especially if you're talking about state legislators making overarching legislation and talking about how do we get to people, how do we do that, is if the we stories you craft are about the state. Right? So again, let's talk about education. It's important to fund education, but the way we do it doesn't necessarily help schools that need the most help.
There's a million ways to do it.
Right. There are. And sometimes, and that's why, of course, all of our states are little laboratories, right? People have different ideas how to do it. And some people are doing a really good job and some people are not. But of course, that also is based on the makeup of your state and where it is and what the people need. So if you wanted to increase education spending, let's say you were going to try that was your thing, then you have to make it worthwhile for all of us. Just like if you want to deal with child hunger. So you roll that in there and you talk about the fact that in order to increase our education rates, we need to deal with child hunger. Every community has hungry children. I personally have been in schools where on that Friday, they send kids home with those baskets of food because they know that if they don't do that, the kids aren't going to eat until they get back on Monday.
We've talked a lot about this notion that great stories, very effective stories, are these we stories, where you're really able to not just think about your group or yourself, but really have that emotional intelligence to think about what does this matter to other people. Actually, this brings us back to the beginning where you said storytelling is about moving people, right? And moving people, I like to think about the neuroscience stuff and it's getting them to feel emotions, which we're all very emotional creatures, even though many people would say, no, not me, I'm Dr. Spock, or not Dr. Spock, Mr. Spock, I'm Vulcan, but we are. So you move people. It really comes down to that, is how do you move people? Make the connection. You just said make the connection.
The story I'm telling is about you. The story I'm telling about everyone is really about you. If you can make the person you're talking to feel that the thing that they're talking to is about you, then you can do anything.
You can do anything. And you can't do that unless you listen a whole lot before you ever step in front of the committee or in front of any other setting.
You know the universals. Know the universals of what you're talking about. And sometimes, again, politics can be dangerous because the universal is, I don't like that person. And then your story is, I don't like them either. And then you get all kinds of crazy stuff. Or the story could be, you are that person. You may not like them, but you are them. And if you are them, then we need to work together to figure out how to go forward together.
It's almost a cliche that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. You hear elected officials say that all the time, but we sure need to start figuring out what connects us. And I think it is the stories, or at least they're a reflection of what connects us.
Folklore is the answer for me always. If you really want to know what people care about, look at the stories that survived the generations, because the seeds of what's in there is what we care about. There's a reason why most people only know 20 stories that come out of folklore. There's a reason for that. There's thousands upon thousands of them. I know more stories now than I ever knew as a child. And all that, but the stories get recycled. The reason for that is those are the stories that speak to us.
Do you lean on African folklore? You mentioned that earlier, or just all kinds of universal folklore?
All kinds of folklore, because they're all the same story.
Because I was thinking about the fact, let's say you go to the least diverse place. Here you're a black woman who's been all over the world. You go to the least diverse place in the United States, or maybe the world, right? You grew up in Asia, which, not a huge African population there. So and I'm thinking about, and you tell an African folklore story in the middle of Maine or West Virginia, states that don't have a hugely diverse population. And of course, we segregate ourselves, right? Audiences are often one way or the other. So, do you see that? Does it still connect? That do you think despite all the ways we're different, whether it's how we grew up, rich or poor, black, white, gender identity, all the ways that people identify as different, there's something universal about folklore and stories?
When I go into homogenous communities, homogenous meaning everyone looks exactly alike, and I am the color, and I go into those communities and tell stories, what always strikes me is that, especially in the library in the evening, I've got a ton of people there. One point I was in there, a little boy comes in, he's like, "She's black," really loud. Mortified his mother's like I didn't know. And so they all sit down and I tell the story, and when I'm done, they're like, "I heard a version of that story. My aunt told me that story." And the kid's like, I didn't know you know that story. And I'm listening to them tell stories to each other as they leave the library. That is a thing that happens all the time because we're all people. And the stories that have sustained us through generations are the same stories. No matter where you are, they're all similar on every continent. I have never been or exposed to a story that I've heard that thought, that story couldn't happen in Africa. That story couldn't happen in Tennessee. That story couldn't happen in Maine. I've never experienced that. And that is what I wish legislators would think about in terms of how you tell stories. We're all exactly the same. Even though we have variations on the theme of people, the stories that move us are the same stories.
That's the biggest lesson, and we got to it here. We touched on it, and then it's a great place to button it up because we are the same. And right now, where there are a lot of forces that want to do nothing but tell us, we're all different, and it's all that. But this is the path. Well, what a delight! How much I enjoy so much visiting with you, and thank you.
And that concludes this episode of our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Our American States, and the special series, Building Democracy. For the National Conference of State Legislatures, thanks for listening.